Developer Type Moon is known for their gripping narratives, from their humble beginnings as a visual novel developer being the most prominent. Besides the global phenomenon of Fate Grand Order and the Fate series as a whole, Type Moon has other IPs united under one writer, Konoko Nasu, which includes the very first title, Tsukihime. This visual novel released in 2000 made an invaluable impact on the genre's growth, so the presence of a remake roughly 2 decades later isn't too surprising. What did come as a shock though was how this remake, Tsukihime, a piece of Blue Glass Moon, released in Japan in 2021, has received an official English localization. Years ago, such a practice would have been considered inconceivable, but with the Western release of fellow Nasu visual novel Witch of the Holy Night, this happening was slightly more believable. Regardless, having had the opportunity to experience Tsukihime, a piece of Blue Glass Moon, in full, I'm again reminded of why Type Moon is such a beloved entity.
屋敷の探索は終わったかね。私としては出戻った人間には自室でおとなしくしていてほしい。それはどうも。こっちも。
There are a few caveats to be addressed before diving into this review. This release is a partial remake / reimagining of the original Tsukihime, adapting only 2 of the 5 routes, Arcuade and Ciel. While this choice seems bizarre, it focuses on quality over quantity, expanding these routes significantly. The other routes are planned to be adapted in a sequel known as The Other Side of Red Garden. Additionally, Tsukihime, a piece of Blue Glass Moon, is not a one-to-one remake of the original Tsukihime. This difference is essential because the original Tsukihime never received an official English localization, putting us in a bit of a weird spot for discussion. That said, I have experienced the original Tsukihime, so I went into this remake with the biases of the experience. Still, it's worth emphasizing that you don't need any prerequisite knowledge before diving into Tsukihime, a piece of Blue Glass Moon. It can be enjoyed entirely standalone with no background context whatsoever. This approach allows new players to dive in without feeling overwhelmed by the weight of the franchise's history. Now let's finally dive into this review. Tsukihime, a piece of Blue Glass Moon, occurs in 2014 in a town of Soya, contrasting the original settings of Misaki Town in 1999, but the plot structure here has been retained. Protagonist Shiki Tono has led a rather tiresome life, to put it mildly. After suffering a life-threatening accident 7 years prior, his father sent him away to live with another family, separating him from the esteemed Tono estate. Further, that same accident forever altered the trajectory of Shiki's life for another reason. For reasons beyond him, he now possesses mystic eyes of death perception, which in simple terms lets him perceive the lines of death, whether they be alive or inorganic. This ability is horrendously powerful, as his cutting of any line of death spells the immediate demise of whoever or whatever is connected. Thankfully, a chance meeting lent him a particular pair of glasses with lenses that block out these mystic eyes, letting him lead a typical everyday life. However, his mundane existence faces a significant shift in the modern day after his father passes away. Shiki is summoned back to live at his family's estate, eventually morphing into a precarious set of circumstances, whether he becomes involved with a certain vampire, serial murder cases, and veiled strife surrounding his origins. Right from the outset, Tsukihime, a piece of Blue Glass Moon, wastes no time establishing a grave tone that, while not always consistent, sets the stage for this tense adventure. Shiki's lack of belonging, thanks to the presence of his mystic eyes, is merely one example of his ambience that permeates almost every scene in one way or another. To be blunt, even compared to other Type Moon projects, Tsukihime can be incredibly dark and brutal with its imagery and presentation, so if you're light of heart, consider yourself cautioned. Still, in terms of writing, Tsukihime excels at balancing sternness and relaxation to deep dive into the cast's relationship and personalities. Shiki's school life, and even his interactions at the Tono estate, have no shortage of congenial interactions that indirectly inform you of the status quo before it inevitably is challenged. Thankfully, no one in the cast feels like a weak link that lowers the immersive efficacy by a few notches. Besides Shiki, who is flawed in his approach to life, each heroine, even those who don't have a route yet, stands out with traits and conflicts that aren't all defining. This engagement even applies to the major characters brand new to this remake, such as Mario, a youth with a foul mouth who is a highly valued church member. Another new character, Noelle, is a new teacher to Shiki's school, though her behavior and intentions are anything but pure. These two play significant roles throughout the main story, especially during Ciel's route. We'll get into that later though.
自分の
おはようございます。
There are even a few characters such as Gato and Dr. Arachi who aren't quite as present yet and are likely in place to establish themselves before the other side of Red Garden. Best of all, these new characters fit in so naturally with the pre-existing narrative, instilling a much grander sense of scale than the original game. This general likability, even for the characters possessing questionable morals, plays an integral role in the post-slice-of-life moments, hiding vestiges of dark. In essence, Tsukihime is a master of tone, never shying away from cruelty emphasized by previous cheerful interactions, and cruel is undoubtedly a fair descriptor of this title. Unlike Witch on the Holy Night, Tsukihime is similar to the typical preconceptions of visual novels regarding the implementation of player choices. As you would expect, these choices determine whether you end up on Ciel's or Arcoide's routes. However, they can also lead to around 24 bad ends that never end well for Shiki. Some of these endings are pretty long, which keeps you on your toes because you're always unsure of your choices. So it's nice to see that these new characters fit in so naturally with the pre-existing narrative. Bad ends do have an amusing byproduct though, which are segments called Teach Me from Miss Ciel. After perishing in the conclusion, you're allowed to enter a fourth wall-breaking abode featuring a teacher version of Ciel, the famous Necro Arc, and even another special guest. Here the host educates you on your choices that lead you to a prospective bad end in comedic ways. Plus, you're hinted at and sometimes blatantly told about what you should do for progression. You can also avoid these segments altogether if you don't want the hints, so no worries there. Still, there are a few moments where it isn't always entirely clear about what your wrong choice was. Usually bad ends are directly preceded by incorrect choices, yet consequences of the latter are sometimes not seen for multiple in-game days, so these teach me moments can help if needed. The humor is what really shines here though. Of course, given the numerous choices, it's evident that Tsukihime, a piece of blue glass moon, features a flowchart. It's pretty simple and not at all tedious since the branches are usually transparent, with unseen events communicated with lock icons. Filling out the flowchart is intuitive and pretty enjoyable if you get into it. Additionally, a decent number of choices simply lead to slightly divergent lines of dialogue that either delve into humor or add a bit reinforced characterization. Regarding the two routes, Arcoide's is relatively similar to the original Tsukihime. Granted, the new setting and time period are taken advantage of with factors like cell phones being present, but the plot structure and flow are comparable. On the other hand, the Ciel route is a brand new beast altogether. While featuring similar story beats as the original, the divergences go off the rails in the best way possible, with the new characters being pivotal instruments to these fresh developments. Alas, this point leads me to my only major critique of the game, as lukewarm as it is. The Arcoide route, while terrifically memorable in its own ways, does feel lesser than Ciel's route. And I say this as one who prefers Arcoide as a character. Ciel's route has much more going on, bolstered by the new cast additions in its remake. As much as I enjoyed Arcoide's, setting it next to Ciel felt like there were missed opportunities. At the same time, Arcoide's route feels more like a beginner course to the lore and relationships, while Ciel's is an expansion and deep dive into the various matters, both directly and tangentially related. So this dichotomy isn't a sole inherent negative. Somewhat humorously, Tsukihime A Piece of Blue Glass Moon is a lengthier experience than its predecessor, Witch on the Holy Night, despite only adopting 2 of the 5 routes. This roughly 40 to 50 hour playtime emphasizes how much richer the experience is compared to the original release, at least regarding the newly defined scale of the cast and consequences. Ultimately, these writing choices all make me curious about how the other side of Red Garden will be adapted, since not only will it feature the routes of the maids and Akiya, but Shiki's classmate Satsuki is seemingly receiving a brand new route of her own. Even when considering the other routes' connectivity, perhaps lessening the workload of entirely separate routes, the sequel has much ambition to fulfill. One of the greatest concerns prospective players have had with this release is the translation and editing quality. While I can't necessarily comment on the formal, the latter is excellent. Save for a handful of noticeable typos that don't detract from the experience, it's undeniable that meticulous care was poured into this translation, so unless you're a diehard fan acutely familiar with the in-universe terminology leading to the potential spotting of fundamental flaws, you don't have any significant quality concerns to anticipate. One last positive for this game regards the presentation, following in the footsteps of Witch on the Holy Night. This is one of the most gorgeous visual novels that I've ever read. The environments, redesigned characters, and battle effects are absolutely superb and do a remarkable job at immersing you in every scenario. Between the vibrancy of daily life and the grime of the supernatural, this release does an amazing job of enhancing the tone and ambience. The soundtrack is a similar quality, so you're getting the whole package in terms of audio and visual appeal. In an age where Type Moon's presence is often attributed to Fate Grand Order above all else, releases like Tsukihime, A Piece of Blue Glass Moon, communicate that the company still shines abundantly beyond these free-to-play confines. Aside from being a stellar remake that introduces new natural elements appealing to both longtime fans and newcomers, the core identity of Tsukihime is still intact, instilling a rebirth sense of nostalgia. This standout visual novel experience excels at emotive character writing, tense battle scenes, and gripping lore that coalesce, displaying Type Moon at its best. Even though the two routes aren't equal lengths, they accomplish their intended jobs splendidly, while setting up the sequel that I can't wait to play. Noisy Pixel is giving Tsukihime A Piece of Blue Glass Moon a 9.5 out of 10. Thanks for watching. This video is brought to you by our supporters on Patreon. Noisy Pixel is run by a group of gamers providing independent gaming coverage through news, reviews, previews, and more. Check out our Patreon to help support our continued growth and subscribe to keep up with all our future content.
Noisy Pixel.